Hey, Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen, leading the movement for movement and bringing you another edition of Autism Fitness Tuesday training, where I take a strategy, a concept, something that we use in autism fitness programming, and bring it to you so that you can bring it to your autism and neurodivergent life skill athletes of any age, any ability, and of course, dogs jumping into the room as soon as I start, which is typical to be expected. In this edition of Autism Fitness Tuesday training, and before I get started, please definitely subscribe, and share this with someone for whom it might make a difference in their programming. We are going to be talking about prompting and cueing and fading, and how do we support an athlete from a physical perspective when they're doing an exercise. So the first thing to discuss is the fact that many of our autism and neurodivergent life skill athletes are going to demonstrate some motor planning and strength deficits. There's a lot of this in the literature, in the research, and certainly something that we can see when we start implementing fitness programming. So it's important to understand that there are three different levels of an exercise, and this can apply to any movement, particularly when we're talking about strength-based training. So our three different levels of performance are standard, modification, and progression. The standard is the point at which the athlete can perform the exercise with healthy and controlled range of motion and motor control throughout the entire set, if that's 8 reps or 10 reps or 12 reps, whatever it is, so that they are getting the greatest benefit out of that particular exercise. That's standard. The athlete can do it on their own with minimal, if not no, cueing or input from much of us as a coach. And if they cannot do that, here's where many people will have a hindrance. Oh, they can't do it to standard. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And that's a lot of what we have in the autism fitness curriculum as well. So what do we do? Well, then we have a modified variation of the exercise. And the key to a good modification is it's still the same exercise with most of the same benefits. We're not bringing in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different corrective exercises in order to train that target exercise. So for example, a squat or an overhead press, we're not going to need to build in all of these other supporting exercises. We just need to know how to modify that squat or press or push-up or whatever it is, because we want the athlete to still derive the same benefit from that exercise. They just need to do a more simplified version of it. So we have our standard, we have our modification, and then of course we have our progression. Progressions are the easiest thing that we're going to do in programming. Add weight or resistance, add repetition. Sometimes we can add time to it as well. Or in the case of like a farmer's walk or a sled push, we can add distance as well. So we have our standard, our modification, and our progression. And once you assess an athlete with that particular exercise, then we have a question of, well, if they can't perform it to standard, at least right now, and that's the goal, then what do we do to modify this exercise? And when we modify an exercise, we have a couple tools that we can use. And in Autism Fitness, we have something that we call label, demo, do, and cue. And this is the foundation of our coaching model. Label, demo, do, and cue is beneficial in that it gives a structure for delivering information and coaching effectively while avoiding the number one problematic issue or mistake made when coaching, particularly the neurodivergent population, which is over-coaching, giving the athlete way too much information verbally before they're doing an exercise. So if we're setting an athlete up for a push-up and we're saying, okay, you're going to do a push-up to the box. So first, set up in front of the box, so knees down on the pad, and then put your hands on the box and then get your chest to the box. And then what you're going to do is look for way too much information. That is over-coaching. In order to coach the athlete effectively and not to overload them with information, we follow this label, demo, do, and cue model, which is labeling the exercise, giving it a name, demonstrating it for the athlete, and then giving them the appropriate cues. Let's talk about those, because there are a couple different ways to cue or prompt our athletes, and it's really going to come down to the athlete's current performance level with that particular exercise. So getting away from, and I'm glad that the old school kind of prompt hierarchy, or not even prompt hierarchies, but the learning styles. I'm glad that these are steadily falling into the cavern of, would it be cavern or canyon? I guess a canyon of no longer being used. Like the more visual learner or the more kinesthetic learner. Really, with respect to exercise, it's going to come down to that particular exercise with that particular athlete, because not every athlete is going to need a physically guided prompt for all of their exercises. They might need a minimal physical prompt or physical guidance for an overhead press, and yet they need a lot more guidance for a standing band row, for example, or a cable row. So it's going to be individual by individual and exercise by exercise. Now, there are a couple different types of modifications or cues that we're going to use. Again, it's going to depend on the exercise. So the reason it's exercise dependent is each exercise functions a little bit differently. They're all going to have some of the same qualities, especially when we're talking about strength-based exercises. So we're going to have a concentric phase, we're going to have an eccentric phase, we're probably going to have some type of pause as well, and to a much, much lesser extent, some type of isometric as well, where the athlete is holding the dumbbells for half a second or a second. The isometric is not so much of a concern. We just want controlled, steady movement throughout the entire range of motion of that exercise. Or if we're talking about a power exercise, we want the athlete to stabilize their low body so that they can do the push throw effectively, etc. But that's a little off topic. With our different modifications or our different prompts, there are three that we generally go to. We have a physically guided prompt, and it's important to use the least amount of physical guidance possible in order to sustain the best performance of that athlete. So we don't want to invade the athlete's personal space. We want to guide. So for example, if we're doing a hand over hand prompt, can we just do 1 or 2 reps of that hand over hand prompt with the athlete so that they get the idea or the concept of doing that exercise? So wherever we can fade back that physical prompt, bonus, awesome. The second way that we can prompt or guide the athlete, and usually the most successful, is going to be a mirror prompt, giving the athlete a visual representation as they're performing the exercise. So for example, if I have an athlete who's doing soft bell overhead presses and I'm mirroring the exercise for them, raising my arms all the way up overhead as they're doing the exercise, that gives them a visual cue for performing the exercise correctly. Coming back to something that I said earlier, because many of our neurodivergent athletes do experience challenges with kinesthetic awareness, it's important to note that they may not be able to perform the exercise with full range of motion the first time, and this is often seen with squats or band pull downs or overhead presses, not because the athlete physically cannot do it, but from a neuromuscular perspective, their motor imitation skills need a little bit more developing, which is fine. We just need to understand where that athlete is right now with their current level of capability and how we need to support that. So the visual prompt, or that mirror prompt, is going to be very helpful in a variety of different exercises. Again, there is a physical prompt that we can use. There is a mirror or visual prompt that we can use in just about every single exercise that we incorporate. We just need to figure out what is going to be the most efficient and effective way to do that. Of course, that's something that we have in our Autism Fitness curriculum for each exercise, understanding what it's supposed to look like, i.e. the standard, so that we can modify it as needed. And then once we determine that the exercise needs a modification, okay, what do we use? Do we use that physical guidance and gradually fade it? Do we use that mirror prompt and figure out the way to fade that as well? And then the final one can be a verbal prompt. Now, when I spoke earlier about overcoaching, we want to be very, very considerate of the language that we're using and when we are using it. So one of the best ways to utilize or incorporate our verbal prompts is not to start giving the athlete a litany of instructions, but to give the athlete very concise cues when they are performing the exercise and giving them feedback in the form of behavior-specific praise, which is one of the strategies that we utilize very often from an adaptive or supportive perspective. So rather than say, okay, you need to get your arms all the way up, once the athlete starts doing that overhead press, I can give them feedback. Great arms up, awesome extending all the way overhead. So to encapsulate everything that I've said, when we are figuring out what the athlete's current level of capability is, so we're running our pack profile assessment, we're looking at the squat, we're looking at the overhead press, we're looking at the farmer's walk, we're looking at the band pull down, we're looking at all of these different phenomenal strength exercises, we then need to determine at what current level the athlete is. If they're at standard, awesome, they're going to need very little additional coaching in order to complete that exercise. If they are not currently at that standard level of exercise, no fear, we just need to figure out how to modify it. Once we've determined that the exercise needs to be modified, there are a couple different ways that we can do that with success. We have our physical guidance, we have our mirror or visual prompts, and then we have our verbal prompts, and with each, there are some best practices in how to incorporate those as well, because we want not only that prompt to be effective, but we also want to be able to fade back so that eventually the athlete is able to become much more independent with that exercise, because the more independent that athlete is with the exercise, the more comfort, capability, confidence they have with the exercise, and especially from a physical perspective, the more likely that exercise is to generalize into activities of daily living, into the real world, which is the entire point of what we're doing with our life skill athletes, developing strength and stability that is going to show up in the real world. So I hope this has been helpful for you. I'd love to know how this has some type of implication for your fitness or adapted PE programs. If it does, or if you have questions, leave those in the comments below. And if there's a topic you'd like me to cover in the future, leave that down there also. Helps the algorithm. Anyway, I'm Autism Fitness founder Eric Chessen, leading the movement for movement. If you are curious or if you're ready to become an Autism Fitness Certified Pro, you can go to autismfitness.com, download the course syllabus, you can register today and begin your coursework, and then meet me or one of our master level pros for your full day, hands-on, brains-on training, so you can bring the best possible fitness and adapted PE programs to the autism and neurodivergent individuals in your world. Thanks for watching.